Nick, welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. This is a highlight of my day. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, listen, great to be here. Looking forward to serving the audience as best I can and taking whatever questions you want to throw my way.
Fantastic. Well, for an Aussie, actually, I'm just going to start a little bit on a tangent here. You're an Aussie based in the UK,
yeah.
And I'm a Canadian. I'm normally based in the UK. I'm looking at snow. You probably are looking at snow, or you were. And are you jealous? Do you wish you were somewhere? Do you wish you were in Australia right now?
Okay, I wish I was somewhere warmer.
Okay.
It's funny. I've lived here since 2003, and I had a stint in the US before. Well, actually, sort of in between. So I was here, then the US, then back. And I haven't been in Australia for a long time, but my body is still sensitive to the temperature that I grew up with. I don't know what that is. It's obviously something. So if I go out in the cold, like it was snowing here in the UK today, my hands get freezing, even if I'm wearing like sort of double layer gloves. So the short answer to your question, Ben, is I always want to be near the sun.
Yeah. All right. Fantastic. All right. Well, for my listeners, it'd be great if you just paint a little bit of a picture as to who you are and what you do. I think that'd be a good place to start.
Yeah, happy to do so. So again, the long story short is I've had a career effectively going into businesses where there are problems that need to be solved. They need to be fixed quickly because there's usually quite a degree of pressure on the particular issue. So if I think about my career, 25 years or so, the first part of it was in corporate life, some pretty large companies like News International and under Rupert Murdoch's empire, and Getty Images, a big private equity-backed business based out of the US. I've had a whole range of different experiences, but I was always the guy that they would bring in to turn things around. Be that a department, be that a project, be that a division, be that a company. Actually, it got to the point where sort of in my later years, I was focused predominantly on private equity. So private equity-backed businesses, and I would go in there and be the turnaround guy, which we can get into because it's got its own interesting battle scars, if that's the way. But I did that for a number of years, and made a lot of money from it because it's a lucrative environment, but at the same time, it can be quite toxic. And the person that I was becoming in that environment wasn't who I wanted to be. So a few years ago, I decided to change that, decided to take the skills that I'd learned from that career and move them into a different place. And these days, I do two things, really. I work with businesses that are generating around 7 figures in revenue, where the owner has the ambition to sell the business for 8 figures. So I help with the transition to that so they can create what is called a liquidity event, buy an island, sit on a beach, buy a Lamborghini, whatever. And then I also help people buy businesses using other people's money. So I'm using my experience in mergers and acquisitions just to create, I think, wealth and freedom for people if they choose to go down that pathway.
Okay, there's lots to dive into there.
That was the short version, Ben.
Yeah, fantastic. No, this is great. Lots to explore, but maybe we could start with turnarounds. And whether in the private equity space or in your prior life in the corporate world, when you look at and think about an organization that's running into some trouble, what have you, in your experience, come across that tends to be, I guess, common or interesting in terms of how those situations occurred in the first place? Is there anything that you've learned that says, yeah, this happens a lot? Sure.
It's a pattern. I mean, the first thing that is always there, if you like, always obvious, is whoever is responsible for project, division, company, loses understanding of exactly what they're trying to achieve. And that sounds a little bit ethereal, I get it, but it's more the fact of, if you don't understand exactly where you're heading, call that vision, and you don't understand why it matters, call that purpose, then you often just get overwhelmed, burnt out, stressed. And then if you're the leader, then all of that energy, if you like, then can be manifested across everyone else who's around you. So more often than not, the businesses that I get involved in now, as was the case when I was working in those other two areas, it all starts with that lack of clarity and associated with that lack of focus.
Mm-hmm. I imagine that might happen slowly. It's that sort of boiling frog type of thing in an organization, because nobody sits there and sort of says, I think I'm going to take it into this direction, and all of a sudden they're in the shit. So
no, well, it's a very insightful way of looking at it, because it's exactly that. And there is a thing here which is not necessarily, I talk about sort of startup and scale up for a second, businesses that are on a certain journey. It's not so much that the business isn't evolving, and therefore that's understandable, because as a business grows, it brings in more complexity as much as it brings in more opportunity. But what it often is the identity of the person leading that doesn't change quickly enough. So I often say, people sort of throw tomatoes at my head when I say this sometimes, particularly if I'm on stage speaking. But I say people who start businesses often can't scale them. It takes a very different mindset. It takes a very different skill set. Now, that's not to say that the person can't change to be able to do that. But if you look at some of the examples of recent history, even businesses like Google, Larry and Sergey had to take themselves out of the business and bring a CEO in because they couldn't take it to the next level. And that's quite an often, obvious trend that you see in that transition. So that's the first observation.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine what's hard particularly if you're a founder, is that letting go. It's your baby, and you've started this thing, and it's you think that what got you where you are is what's going to get you to the next place, and it's that realization that no, that may not be the case, and we need to change.
That's it.
I imagine.
That is it.
Yeah.
And you said two things there that are important. Firstly, it's the recognition that change needs to happen, and that part is often quite difficult. And the second point around control is really a lot about how you feel about yourself and your tolerance of fear. And a lot of people, you're right, when they've put so much energy into something, be that a business from the beginning, they struggle with the concept of anyone else. They it's just too important for them to risk it. But the funny paradox is that if they don't do that, they'll never grow. So people often ask me, what's the definition of scale up? And the most simplest definition is the ability to build teams and lead people really effectively, and the ability to bring systems and processes in that can align those people properly behind the right outcomes, results that you want to achieve. Now, both of those things rely on trust and letting go. So that's why the point around the identity of that founder, that business leader, is such a fundamental part of the process.
Where do you think that fear comes from? You talked about a fear of letting go. Where does that come from? If we could dive into that momentarily.
God, fear, fear is such a subjective, personal thing. Because, the real answer to your question is a deep answer, right? It comes back to past programming. It comes back to experiences, environments, people that you have around you today, people you had around you 10 years ago, everything that kind of impacts how you see the world. And there's an interesting point about this. I think you and I might be in the same situation, but we might see it very, very differently based on our experiences previously to that. So fear for me, what fear is ultimately is thinking that the worst that could happen is actually going to happen. Before it's actually happened, before there's any evidence that it's going to happen. But you think that there's enough going on around that, my business is going to fail, or the product that I'm launching is going to fail. I'm going to have, no job, no money. I'm not going to be able to survive. Everyone's going to think I'm a failure. All of those things haven't happened, right? And equally, just as likely is the opposite, right? That it's a massive success. You retire with millions in the bank in your 30s or 40s or whatever it ends up being. But fear is really what you manifest. So it's a hard answer in terms of the detail, but it all stems from the same thing. It's the thinking the worst outcome based on very little evidence that is going to be the case.
Mm-hmm. So when you were in the turnaround space, quite clearly, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have started with quite clearly, but perhaps you didn't you didn't jump in to any assignment and say, hey, Mr. CEO, whatever, let me sit you down on my sofa here and we can talk about meaning and letting go and fear. So you probably came in and did, boring kind of financial analysis and mapped processes and looked at markets and things. But how do you get to, there's that point between you can map out what perhaps needs to be done versus what is going to get done. And maybe if you walked through the process of, say, a typical turnaround, how would that look like?
So it comes back to, you've got to meet people where they're at, right? So one of the reasons why my podcast has been successful, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit about it, is because it's not really about business. It's called Scale Up Your Business, but it's actually about mindset. Right now, if I called it, your mindset is your secret weapon or something like that, something cheesy, no one would listen to it. All right? But Scale Up Your Business is a pretty, do you want to grow and scale your business? Is that what you want? It's a very clear message and therefore result. But to your question, more often than not, everything stems down to the mindset of the leader or the leadership team. It could be the investors that are there. It can be the CEO. Somewhere in the dynamic, there is going to be a mindset issue that usually stems back to fear. Now, you're 100% right. When I first start working with a team, a founder, a CEO, and this was my experience, all the way through my career, you'd never start with that. Right? I would ask questions very early on, and I'd know the answer well and truly before I would communicate it. But I would need to first and foremost look at I always get this wrong, symptoms versus cause. I'd have to look at what was actually happening in the business to then be able to communicate that piece and then be able to get to the root cause. So, are you not selling enough? Have you got lots of staff that are leaving? Are you getting beaten by competitors? Are you just not growing anymore for whatever reason? You're just absolutely on that treadmill and not growing. So they're the things that are measurable, and usually you'll start there and you go, okay, let's go deeper. Why is that happening? Why is that happening? And you will get to some skill set issues, the wrong people, wrong seats. But more often than not, it's usually a lack of communication, lack of clarity, lack of focus, lack of vision, and underpinning that, a poor strategy that is then enabling anything that's going on.
Mm-hmm. I realize we're talking a lot about diagnosing things and mindset and so forth, but I just want to talk a little bit about the private equity world, because if we continue down that path, someone listening to this might think private equity sounds like an awesome career path, because you're talking about psychology, mindset, and also diagnosing problems. But you did refer to a toxic working environment, and I'd love to explore a little bit about what was going on in that space and then how that led you to eventually leaving.
Yeah, so I mean, it's changing, and I think it's changing because it had to change. I mean, the best way to look at it is, you look at the TV shows. Like if you go back to the Wall Streets, Michael Douglas, and I think it was Charlie Sheen, greed is good, I think, is the mantra in that. And that's what it used to be like. It's not as bad as that anymore. And then I suppose probably another frame of reference, there's a TV show called Billions, which is, again, very much about sort of hedge funds and all that. And I suppose when I say toxic, what I mean is it can be very addictive in terms of the money you can make. And, there are a lot of smart guys in sharp suits sitting around the table that can manipulate the conversations just based on expert knowledge. They know how to read, spreadsheets really well. They can draw patterns. And what I found was happening is a lot of these, particularly founders, entrepreneurs, were coming into these environments, and they weren't armed with the right information, the right confidence, actually, to be able to stand up, go toe to toe in these environments. And I saw, I wouldn't say, there's a saying, caveat emptor, buyer beware. You could argue that there's a seller beware situation here where the CEO or the entrepreneur doesn't really know, so therefore it's their problem. So if they sell their business cheaply or they get a bad deal, they agree to terms which are unfavorable, that's their fault. But I just found that a little bit, as I said before, intoxicating, and I didn't want to be part of that. So the way it happens is this. I was doing a couple of big deals, One of them, which we ended up doing, was a 10-figure deal. So that's over $1 billion. And I just started to feel really quite ill and sick in myself. And I wasn't showing up very well at home. I was just being a bit irritable, very irritable, if I'm being honest. And I wasn't setting the example for my children and my wife that I knew was important to me. And then one night, this is full on, right? One night, everything was stressed. I'd had a situation where my father had recently passed away as well, and everything was really full on. And I went to sleep and I broke all the teeth in the right side of my jaw. I literally grinded my teeth right here. And I could, they're literally shards of teeth. I remember waking up at 3 a.m. and like this was all swollen. It was like I'd been smashed in the face. And I didn't know what had happened. I actually thought I'd either fallen out of bed or I'd been bitten by something. And I went to the doctor, and this was like, we tried to get back to bed, took some medicine, went back to sleep, went to the doctor in the morning, then I went straight to the dentist. And the dentist said, yeah, you've literally clenched down and you've cracked all your teeth by your jaw. And it was one of those fantastic lessons in life that you get, and you look back in hindsight and go, what a gift, right? But effectively, it was a sign that I wasn't following what I should be doing. So I called up a friend of mine literally a day later, a guy who was more entrepreneurial than me, had a different sort of experience with entrepreneurship. He was more of a startup guy, whereas I was a turnaround guy. But he retired in his 20s with about $65 million Australian dollars in his bank accounts, and now he was just kind of living on literally a beach. And I called him up, and he was always a bit weird at university. He was always the guy that we're out drinking, playing pool, and he would just be either studying or doing something weird like reading a book. And he said to me, listen, it sounds like you've had heaps of achievement in your life, Nick, but you have no fulfillment. And I was like, it kind of hit me, and I thought, I don't really understand what fulfillment means. And he said something bizarre. He said, okay, I don't want you to second guess this. I don't want you to think with your head. He said, I want you to go look up this website, and I want you to book on the next event that's coming up. And it was a Tony Robbins event. And he said, I want you to go to one of these events. And he said, don't pass judgment, just go and do it. So I did. I effectively did. I looked up Tony Robbins. I'd read a couple of his books. I thought he was a jerk. Rah, all this stuff. And I got on the next plane to Chicago 2 weeks later and went to an event called Unleash the Power Within, which is a 4-day event. And it was game-changing for me in terms of just understanding patterns. And so I made the decision at that event to quit my private equity gig. I came back. I built a machine. And what I mean by that is I built what I do now. I've got 7 companies now and a whole heap of different things that I do. But I built that machine before handing in my notice. And I effectively started the podcast, did all these things. It's only a couple of years ago. And what then happened was I gave myself a little bit more of a hedge because I had so much money that I'd made. I didn't want to risk my family not having the things they'd had. And literally it took a year before the private equity firm got annoyed. They pulled me into their office and said, Nick, you've got to get rid of the podcast. I had the letter in my bag and I said, that's it. And then it's a little bit like if you've ever done a house build, Ben, and I'll shut up after this, where you kind of build the house and then you knock through before you kind of get to the extension. I built the infrastructure already so that as soon as I handed in my notice, it was absolutely done and dusted. I was ready to go.
Mm-hmm. I like how you progressively did that rather than, I know you described the Tony Robbins event as game-changing, but it's not like you quit your job right after that.
No, and it's a really important point here. I want to kind of draw a line under it because Tony Robbins talks about burning the boats. And effectively, his whole saying is, if you want to take the island, you've got to burn the boats, meaning that there's no way off the island except for winning. And I don't advocate that. I don't judge it, but at the same time, if you've got responsibilities and all these other things that I had, young children, mortgages and all that, I didn't want to create chaos for them because I also thought that my mind space wouldn't be right. I didn't want to be from a situation of my own personal fear. I wanted to be in a situation where I had some level of control over the decisions. So it was risky because I effectively built a company that I wasn't operational in, that was generating 6 figures of income part-time. right? So I didn't break any of my contracts, but it was like, how do you do that? Well, I just did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was risky, but you didn't take the decision lightly, and you did it in incremental steps. So I find it interesting also that you contradict one of Tony Robbins's mantras, or say, or whatever, because I think, just a little tangent on some of this sort of stuff, that the likes of a Tony Robbins or anyone else who's in the self-help space, is that sometimes it gets treated as kind of as gospel, that you have to follow to the letter what these people recommend. And actually you can expose yourself to some of this stuff, take what's useful, but not follow things as a formula.
That's right. And I think everything in life needs to be a little bit like that. You've got to, because I'm an avid reader, and I don't, anything I read, I take elements that I think are going to work, and I might apply those things to my life. And the same thing with any personal development. I think that the learning for me was this, is that I needed to break some patterns that had kind of come into my world in various ways, probably from being a youngster. And I didn't know how to do that. So what I learned from Tony Robbins was how to do that and what was going on in a much more objective way, a non-emotional way. And then once I understood how those things worked, I then had the mind space to be able to build what I wanted to build, which was a life more on my terms, being able to create wealth. I've got more stuff now than I had before, but be able to do other things around how I created that, as opposed to it being dictated by someone else.
How much of what you were dealing with was also a bit of some dissonance between what you were doing and your values? As you talked a little bit about the entrepreneurs who might be getting manipulated by some of the decisions, or by some of these other colleagues or folks that are doing this, because private equity firms might come in, want to turn something around, and also see more value than the entrepreneur sees. So there's that delta, and so somehow the entrepreneur isn't seeing that delta, or not able to to close that gap. And maybe that's fine. Maybe they might say, look, I've taken this business as far as I can, I'm going to flip it and cash out. But I know some entrepreneurs who've done that, and they say, well, a bit of me has gotten lost in doing that. Yeah. And
it was for me more just the fact that when I was getting sent into these situations, I assume it's probably like getting sent off to war as a sniper, and you have to, there's a point where if you start to see things from the other side, your perspective changes. So it was more the fact of, if a private equity firm said to me, go in there, manipulate the situation, right? So we get a disproportionate advantage, right? Because we can then make more money. Not illegal stuff, right? But just levels of influence, let's call it that. And of course, if you have a skill or an ability to influence at a high level, it can be a superpower, but at the same time, it can be, a force of evil. So it's things like that. It's like, you will go in there and you will do this. Right. And I go, yeah, I don't really think that's the right thing to do. I don't care. Mm-hmm. And so I just didn't want to do that anymore. And I also had the personal vision, having sat on one side of the table, watching all these people come in looking to sell their businesses. I realized that I could create a number of viable businesses on the other side of the table. And I would be more happy doing that. And the one thing that happens now, which is, I'm quite proud of, is if I'm representing, a founder or a CEO of a company, and then I turn up and I'm helping them sell that business, some of the people that they know my experience, and they know my reputation, they're like, oh. Because it's like they know that they're not going to get, it's going to be fair on both sides. I'm not, but they realize now that the playing field has been leveled somewhat.
Yes. Great. Cool. That's fantastic. And I imagine you've got some interesting stories and from the entrepreneurs that you work with, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that. So being on that sort of that scale up side, and what you've learned from doing your podcast, from the topics and the people you've had on, and that I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I'll treat both those questions separately, because they do cross over, but there are some
and possibly with just to add another layer here, but just from the point of view of risk and uncertainty. So there's probably loads of things that you could draw on.
But, do it through a lens of that if you like, because I think it'll be helpful for the listeners. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, God, there's so many things. I mean, what often happens, and I'll kind of give you the sort of scenario, is I'll normally be brought into a business, as I said, where the owner, the founder, has just run out of ideas. They've got people around them. They're not quite sure what their next move should be. They're starting to doubt their ability, just because, as I said, what they could do in the beginning that worked extremely well just doesn't work any well. And because, remember, when you're running a company, it's very lonely anyway. So, that can challenge your own belief systems and your psychology. So you can go from someone who feels like they've got the Midas touch to someone who feels like they've got nothing very, very quickly. So more often than not, I get brought in at that point, and as I said, the first thing is just understanding why they have this thing in the first place. And that's where there is a little bit of a balance about, is this a vehicle that's going to help your life? Is it something that, excuse me, sits next to a greater mission about impact? What's the financial goal? All those things. And we often work backwards from some form of events. So when I'm working with they're larger businesses I work with, they often want to sell, right? They're not just trying to think these things are going to be around for perpetuity. So when I go in there, the first piece I look at, I've got a thing called 6 peaks of value creation. There's 6 lenses, nothing earth-shattering. I didn't invent all of them, but I've just thought about all the businesses I've turned around, and they always have one or two of these 6 things is not working. So the first one is purpose, which is what I articulated at the very beginning. You need to know why you're doing what you're doing. You need to know where you're going. You need to know what your starting point is, and that's all packaged under that sort of purpose and vision. The next piece is profit. And a lot of businesses, particularly through COVID, just haven't had the cash resources, the runways. And again, that creates scarcity. And if you haven't got enough money, you're always thinking about whether the business is going to survive. It just doesn't put you into a psychological state to be able to make the right decisions. So it's not really about investment. It's just having a relentless focus on profitability. There's a great book by a guy called Michalowicz called Profit First, which is great for small business owners around this mindset. The third area is proposition, or it could be extended to say value proposition. So do you actually have something which is solving a problem for someone in the market? So clearly identified niche, clear problem, and do you have a solution? And this is an interesting one, back to risk and all that, because the pace of change right now, just because of digital and disruption and all that sort of stuff, has never been greater. So a lot of founders think they're still solving a problem that existed 12 months ago, but the problem doesn't exist anymore. Right? So I suppose the watch out here is you've got to always be externally focused. The more you become insular, which again comes back to fear, you focus on the narrow. Once you get into that position, you are lost. So that's the third area. The fourth area is predictability. All businesses that are sold for significant amounts of money have a predictable flow of the right customers driving recurring revenue. Now, that means a really solid sales and marketing machine. It also means a good understanding of either contracting or subscription models. But you don't want to have a business which always has to go out there hunting every second minute for their next, meal. And so many businesses are like that. And they have to start day one of their financial year, they've got to start again. And it's just so hard. It takes too much money. It's not investable longer term. So you've got that. That's the fourth one. The fifth one is process, understanding how that you can build process and automation into your business. And then the last one is obviously people, but not just people in terms of capability, also the cultural dynamics that are important. So that's where values come in. That's where behaviors come in. And if I go back and summarize all that to your question, and then we can get into the podcast, but any one of those 6 will derail you. Aligning all 6 will get you flying. Most businesses are good, as I said, at 1 or 2 or 3, and they need to optimize and focus on, the one that's holding them back. And everything's measurable. Everything can be then, recorded. It can be project managed. And when I go into businesses, we often, it's almost like a done for you thing. We work for 12 months and we fix the whole thing up, like renovating a house.
Mm-hmm.
And then once that happens, it's on a different trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answers the question. It's very
makes
precise.
a lot of sense. I love
it's very precise.
Mm-hmm. I love models like that, and as you said, there's nothing fundamentally new there, but packaging it up in a way that is understandable and measurable is a great first step. Is there any common threads to or commonalities around of those 6 ones where entrepreneurs struggle the most? Do you find?
Well, more often than not, people don't think it's going to be the first one around purpose, but it often is.
Okay.
So that's the one, and because as I said, like there's normally a decision-making blockage, which then means communication isn't clear. So it may be that let's just say the sales and marketing engine is absolutely fine, or has the ability to be fine, but the direction that it's getting from the leadership team is not precise enough, not clear. So therefore, it's suboptimal. Quite often, the CEO or the founder will say, "Oh, sales and marketing isn't working," and I'll go, "Okay, well, we can evaluate that. We can look at everything, right? We can look at all the predictability in terms of leads. We can talk at your sales process. We can talk about the team. But are you being clear enough, right?" So one of the things when someone brings me in, we work on what we call a 90-day cadence. 90-day cadence is just a pattern of working within the business. It's versioned a little bit from a book called The 12-Week Year. As I said, I take things, but I change them based on what I think is going to work. And the whole principle is that if you're focused enough, you can achieve, as much in a year as some people can in 12 weeks, 90 days, if you are disciplined about what you do. Mm-hmm. So under that first piece, I'll sit there and go, okay, let's get super clear. What really matters in the next 90 days? Now, what matters in the next month? Therefore, what matters this week? Therefore, what are you going to do today? And we bring that discipline in, and then all of a sudden, the sales and marketing problem isn't really a sales and marketing problem anymore, because there's clarity, at that top table.
Do you have any interesting companies or stories that you work with, either companies or individuals that have either turned things around or come across some realizations that you're proud of?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got a lot. A lot of them are the smaller stories. I mean, I had a smaller business I was working with, so it's I normally work with 7-figure businesses, but I've got a few of the sort of high 6s. This was a business that tripled its revenue growth last year through COVID, and it came off 1 hour conversation about mindset that I had with the founder, which was a bit of I don't want to kind of break confidentiality. So, but basically what happened was I just said to him, you've got to stop stuffing around, mate, right? You've got to really step into this and lean into this in a way which you've never done before. And I basically told him, quite frankly, quite bluntly, your business is going to fail. You've probably got 6 weeks, right? And obviously a longer conversation, but there was some evidence around that, and he went away. I didn't, sometimes it's funny. I have these conversations. You don't know how people are going to react, but you've got to be honest, brutally honest, candid. And he came back, he heard it, and as I said, the result was a tripling of the business within about 9 months.
Wow.
And we didn't change anything else other than his mindset, really. I mean, he did stuff after that. He introduced some new product lines. He did some things, but it was all about how he was making decisions. So that's one. Another one that I got involved in about 12 months ago was, and this I said before about solving complex problems. I had to basically totally change the investment structure of a business. I had to clear the cap table and get rid of all these toxic investors and bring in a whole new investor suite. And that's difficult, right? So, but that comes back to, again, finding out exactly what the issue is, having some tough conversations, working with the founder on a whole new structure, seeking investment, which we did. This one here, we actually went to the biggest customer, the biggest client of this particular business. We got them to invest, and that allowed us to buy out all of the toxic investors and totally change the trajectory of the business.
When you say toxic investors, what What do you mean?
Toxic environment
toxic
is a
investor?
more accurate explanation.
Okay.
What often happens, and in some cases it is toxic investors, because, like I said beforehand, there's a lot of shark frenzy in the water of where there's lots of fish, right? And it can get bloody. And a lot of founders, when they start off in startup, they just think any money is good money. Anyone who's going to sign a check is the right person.
Right.
And you can get that. It's like, oh, wow, I raised this money. The big question is not whether you raise the money. The big question is about, who have you just signed up to be a partner? So when I say toxic, there are investors sometimes who understand that dynamic. It's all sweet, it's all nice, it's all romantic. And as soon as the check is signed, it all changes. And, the CEO is now, stuck there with the knuckles in the shackles, so to speak, and that's it. So that's what I mean by it. So it's not, back to my point, it's not really that, whose fault is that? It's no one's fault. It's just you've got to be, aware that these things. But yeah, so I get involved in all sorts of stuff. There's fast growth scale ups to 9 figures. There's divorces, like I just mentioned, but they're all about how do you unblock anything that's holding the business back from growth.
Right. Is there anything around things going wrong that, I think you touched on one of them, that transfer perhaps to other aspects of decision making or even life? For example, you mentioned brutally honest, and I found that resonated with me, because I think when the shit hits the fan, you have to take stock. I mean, you have to be really realistic as to what's happened, how big the damage is, and face up to the situation before you can do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, people respond to different people, right? But I personally think that a standard of no fluff and no bullshit, right, is that idea of being, as I said, brutally honest, is the only thing that can often get everything clear, or get everything on the table, probably is a better way of saying it, to then be able to make things clear. So, and I'm really, if I work with someone, I say from the outset, this is what it's going to be like. Okay, this is not about, I don't need the money, right? And I don't need, to be here just to carry your boxes in and your shopping out of the car, right? There's a lot of people who do advisory and consultancy, and they're desperate for work, and they'll do whatever. Let's be clear, you have to enroll me to work with you. And if that's the case, if that's going to work, now we're going to get to work, because the only thing that matters is the result. So some of the edge that I got, I suppose, from those private equity environments, because you have to be tough, right? I still take that into my client relationships. But I find that a bit of grit and resilience around the edges actually makes them stronger and better leaders overall. Not always.
Yeah.
But then I'm probably not the right person to be working with them.
Probably, yes. Is there anything that you've learned as well around how successful entrepreneurs make decisions under uncertainty?
Yeah.
Or take risks, or deal with, maybe COVID is a great backdrop to this, because there's so much uncertainty in the air.
Yeah, I noticed a lot through COVID. I think there are different types of leaders is the first starting point. There are those that hibernate and they have different ways of coping with the change curve, and there are ones that feel like they need to lead from the front. Both of those different, let's call it identities, still stem from the same thing, which is fear, right? Fight or flight. But I think, in terms of how can you make the best decisions in uncertainty is probably a nice way of reframing the question. And I found that you've got to understand the importance of emotional control. You've got to understand how to manage your own emotions and have routines and habits around those things, so that when you are put under pressurized situations, you're going to be in a resourceful state, as much as possible. And a lot of people don't get this, so it's worth spending a minute on. It's exactly like going to the gym and working a muscle. It's exactly the same. If you want to get in great shape, get a six-pack, whatever your goal is, it's not going to happen just sitting around the place. If you want to be really laser focused, in charge of your emotional states, you have to work on that daily through various habits. Meditation is an interesting one. I do it daily, but a lot of people still find it weird. But I find that meditation isn't really as weird as it sounds. It's really just an experience of practice of focus, the ability to be able to be fully present on one task or one situation. And again, if you can do those things, it does mitigate risk, because you are preparing for what ultimately could be the worst outcome. The other way of probably framing it is, when you see Navy SEALs or whatever going and doing all their training, they're only doing all that training for what is often a very small amount of time in an actual event, but it's the practice that allows them to do that. And I think any business leader needs to understand that that's important if you want to be really outstanding and world class.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The practice of meditation is one that so many people come back to and is incredibly valuable. And I think the training your mind is, for many, the kind of final frontier of peak performance, and one that's often neglected. Yeah,
it's flow state. I mean, it's ultimately that, and meditation is just one thing. But I remember, I'll give you a very, very small 10 seconds on this. I play a lot of basketball, and I'm the oldest guy on the court. And we had our championship last year, sort of pre-COVID. And I remember in the championship game, I ended up scoring something like 30 points and didn't miss a shot. It was crazy, right? And it was an outstanding game. But what it was is, in that pressurized situation, so our best player was out. He was, fouled out, and someone had to step up. And I guarantee that my ability to do that at that point in time was because of my practice of meditation plus other things. There's nothing else I can put it down to. But I was super present in that particular 40 minutes or whatever. And I trained myself to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cool. The other thing that you do is endurance sport, and you've run some ultra marathons and some marathons. And I'm an avid cyclist, and I've done a few multi-day stage races and a few marathons, but not nearly as many as you've done. So I'm just wondering what, if anything, you get that's transferable from doing that to the other things that you do.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what we just spoke about, but in a different way. If you put yourself in challenging situations, particularly situations where, and the ultra endurance stuff is fascinating because, as I'm sure there's no certainty that you're going to finish, let alone perform at your peak, right? I've done sort of 100-mile races through the mountains, and it doesn't really matter too much about, the mindset is part of it, the body is part of it, but anything can happen, right? You can fall down and you can do your ankle and all that. But it's what you learn going through that then sort of toughens up the mind and the spirit or whatever. And, there's a guy called David Goggins who wrote a book called Can't Hurt Me. He's probably the extreme of this, but, he talks about callousing the mind, and I think there is something in that. So if I'm in a really tough negotiation, or I'm dealing with something difficult, it could be a client, it could be a situation that a client's got, I don't feel like I can be beaten because I've taught myself not to give up through hours and hours and hours of training. And that doesn't mean that it always works out, right? But if it's not going to work out, it's not because I gave up on it. And that's what the endurance, I mean, you can probably get it from other things. Other professional sports people I know have a very similar psychology. But I've just found that the level that you have to push your body and therefore your mind in those events is transferable to lots of other things.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. And it, as you say, it's training. It's all mental training.
Yeah.
And the mind and body are they're connected, and we often lose sight of that. We think, just cerebral, prefrontal cortex, everything that happens here is what matters in business, but it's not. Everything else matters. I did want to just touch on balance here as well, because you've got a family, you do all this stuff.
Yeah.
And if you listen to, I'm sure there'll be people that listen to this and say, well, how does this guy manage, 7 businesses and family, training, everything else, the podcast? what do you, I mean, are you just sort of wired differently, or are there things that you do that perhaps
Yeah,
others could do?
I wasn't always as intentional with stuff. I had to learn it, and I think once I was sort of going through my own sort of journey, if you like, in the private equity days, I kind of realized that it's not necessarily how intelligent you are. It's the how you can manage, or actually probably master time is a better way of saying it. So I know that, some people, and this is where discipline comes in, right? So some people will say, okay, I'm going to spend 3 hours a night watching Netflix. Okay. I spend an hour a night reading a book. Okay. Same, time frame, you could argue. And then I might watch an hour of TV with my wife. But then I'll do something which I think is more productive around my goals. So I'm intentional with how I set various things I want to achieve. I have a very, very clear process around how I do that. I have a thing called Sunday System of Success, which I do on a Sunday, which is 2 hours where I plan my week against the goals that I want to achieve over the next 90 days. I time block every day. In fact, as I'm looking at my diary as we're speaking, and there's about 8 colors in my diary, and each of those colors are based on my various goals. All right, super. When people look at it, they go, "Oh my God, what are you on?" But there's a lot of fun in the diary, right? I've got, for example, today, walk with my girls. That was from 10 until 12 p.m. today because the snow was out, right? I have a strategic block, thinking time, which was for 3 hours today, right? At the end of the week, I've got a breakout block, which is 2 hours where I can do whatever I want. That I can read a book, I can, go for a run. It's just my time. I've got lots of content that I'm producing. I've got clients to deal with. So everything is intentional. So what I don't do is let someone else control my time. And therefore, how do I run? How do I see my family? How do I run the businesses? I get intentional, and then I leverage, and nothing goes in unless it's got a specific outcome to it. And people, and well, I'll say this, because I do appreciate people listening going, "Oh my God, that just sounds horrendous." But I believe, and it comes from a guy called Jocko Willink, that I believe discipline equals freedom. And people who are miserable are normally the ones that aren't taking enough control of that. And they go, "Oh, I can't be disciplined." Well, it's a choice, right? You've just got to have a really strong why behind it. So that's how I do it.
Yeah. One thing I just wanted to point out about what you said there, which I think is really important, is you scheduled some time in for yourself. You schedule some time in to spend with your family. And so it's not like you're hyper optimizing everything you talk about an outcome, but the outcome could be, spend some time with your family, or to, read a book or something. And there are people that are, that might be thinking, well, if everything is hyper optimized, that means I've got to be super productive all the time. But what you're doing is scheduling some time to decompress or to let ideas flow as well. And I think that's sometimes lost, and that's very important. I'm glad that you I know you pointed that out.
It's a really powerful point that we should again just reiterate. So I have a morning routine. I think a lot of successful people do. Certainly, all the people who have come on my podcast, they all have something. Doesn't mean you have to get up at 5 a.m. by the way, but you have a routine which is about you and your state first thing in the morning to set up the day. I have that 5 days a week, really, really quite focused. And then on the weekends, I don't care, right? So I get up at 5, I go running, I do all this stuff. But on the weekends, there's no alarm. If I get up at 10, I get up at 10, right? I don't drink alcohol. I find that doesn't work very well with entrepreneurship. That said, I would never say it's never. It's just that it's a very rare occasion. So I have balance in terms of I make decisions based, I suppose, on an 80-20 principle. 80% of the time it's going to affect what I want to achieve. 20% of the time I have flexibility based on just being spontaneous.
Like it. That's great. Wonderful message. I'm just conscious of time, and I'm aware that we need to wrap up. Before we did do that, first of all, was there anything that you wanted to mention or touch on that we didn't get a chance to?
We didn't get into the podcast. I know you wanted to. I think
you
wanted to ask me about that.
I did want to, yeah.
Because
Talk a little bit about the podcast. Why did you start it? Where can people find it? All that good stuff.
Yeah, I'll give you the quick version of the piece. So I started it after the Tony Robbins event, and I started it because when I went to the Tony Robbins event, the thing that really hit me is he does this thing where you start to align your heart waves with your brain waves. It sounds a bit odd, but it comes back to breathing. But the whole idea is that when your head and your heart are aligned, and there's a way of measuring this, you make better decisions and you can make more intuitive decisions. And he does these different things where it's like almost like a guided meditation when you're in these events, and it's pretty powerful. And I remember when he was doing this thing, this kind of thought came to me, which was the reason you're not feeling fulfilled is because you don't have enough external contribution. You're not helping enough people, basically. You're not feeling that sort of value that comes from doing that. And there was a quote that he said. I'd never heard this quote before, but it's an old quote from Zig Ziglar, which is, if you help enough people get what they want in life, you'll have everything you want and need in life. And I never knew that because everything was about me, how much money I could make, who I could, screw over in terms of that. I was part of that environment. So I started the podcast because I wanted to have a vehicle to tell my story. I wanted it to be a little bit cathartic for me, to be frank. So there was a selfish intent just because I needed to get some stuff out of my head. And of course I thought, well, how can I then use that story and that journey? Because a lot of it's about my own mindset shifts, and then also weave in all the stuff that I'd learned from years and years of doing these business turnarounds. And so Scale Up Your Business became that. It became a vehicle of many things. I did the first 25 episodes, just me to the mic, no paper, no preparation. And in some cases, it's 40 minutes of me just rambling. No, nothing, just saying, I'm going to tell you about how I set goals. Now I'm going to tell you about what happened to me as a kid growing up. And it grew really quickly, I think, because I had so much of that transparency within it. And now we're 140 odd episodes in. It was number 1 in the UK, number 17 in the US business charts.
Fantastic.
And just some great conversations, just to finish on the point, some great conversations with amazing people. And I enjoy, doing what we're doing today, Ben. I never take any of this stuff for granted, because I learn stuff all the time, and that's been the gift of it. And from that, I've created other things, but it's been such a powerful thing for me personally. That's why I love it.
Fantastic. I love that, Nick. And I can speak to that as a podcaster. You get so many intangible and residual benefits you never knew that you would get before you started. So
yeah, power of communication,
congrats
connection,
on that.
and
yeah,
particularly this last 12 months, we've gone through different experiences of that. I've made so many great friends. It's funny, I've got friends, business partners, new clients that have all come from never ever having to meet someone face to face, physically, because we're face to now talking. But that's bizarre, right? Isn't it? But I love the fact that you can still get that connection without having to have that physical presence.
It's fantastic. I'm just conscious of time before we wrap up. Where can people find you, follow you, subscribe to the podcast, all that good stuff? Yeah,
so yeah, if people, the podcast is Scale Up Your Business. You can find that in the usual places, iTunes, Spotify. Have a listen. As I said, it's my journey as much as it is everything else, but I'm always grateful for people who listen to it. If people have got a business and they want help, we have Scale Up Your Business as a Facebook community. There's about 3,000 people in there. I'm involved in that a little bit, but it's really just to connect people. And if people want to reach out to me, they can get me at LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn or Instagram. They're probably my two sort of social channels. And then our website is suyb.global, which is obviously Scale Up Your Business. But that's where we have more the advisory stuff that we do. But as I said, it's for me these days, I get to live, how I want to live. I get to help people how I want to help. And that to me is the most important stuff.
Fantastic. Well, this was great, Nick. Keep doing what you're doing. Really enjoyed this, and I'm sure my listeners are going to enjoy this as well. Yep. Thank you very much.
Appreciate you, Ben. I appreciate the time on the show, and it's been, I would just want to point out that, your thoughtfulness of questions and your preparation is excellent, and I do appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.